All right, what's going on, everyone? So overnight, it appears that Israel began preparations for a military operation in Rafah. We're going to talk about what that means, why now, and what to expect going forward. It's a lot to get into, so I'm glad you're here. Now, yesterday news came out that Israeli Defense Minister Gallant spoke with U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, where he informed him that the hostage negotiations and ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas had fallen through, and he said, quote, "There was no choice left, and the meeting was the start of the Israeli operation in Rafah," kind of signaling it's time. And there's also been indications earlier today and late yesterday that the Israeli War Cabinet has approved the first phase of the operation in Rafah. Then what we saw just in the last few hours was Israel has begun dropping leaflets for evacuation of certain portions of Rafah. It sounds like the easternmost neighborhoods, not the entire city at this point. I'll show some of the leaflets here that are being dropped all across Rafah at this point. The red leaflet shown here says the IDF will be operating against the terrorist organizations in the area where you are located, as it has operated until now. Anyone found near terrorist organizations endanger themselves and their family members. For your safety, the IDF urges you to evacuate immediately to the expanded humanitarian area in the Al-Mawasi area. We warn you that Gaza City is still a dangerous active combat zone. Avoid returning north of Wadi Gaza. We warn you to stay away from the eastern and southern security fences. And this is actually a theme in a couple different statements that Israel's put out, kind of hitting on the concerns of the Egyptian government, is warning the people of Rafah, do not approach these security fences south with Egypt or east with Israel. Additionally, we got news that Israel began conducting airstrikes in portions of Rafah yesterday. There was one that certainly targeted a rocket launch location. We're going to get more into that here in just a moment. But the IDF says they also, in some of these airstrikes, hit sniper positions, buildings used by terror groups, and other infrastructure in and around the Rafah area. So talking about the importance of Rafah here, we've talked about this operation on this channel before recently, the last few videos here. Israel moving into Rafah in a military capacity hasn't really been a question of if, but when. If you're watching the news and these statements coming out of Israel, this has never been off the table. It's always been on the table, and there's a good reason for that, right? One of Israel's major goals throughout the course of this war is to make sure that Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel going forward. It's very hard to do that if some of the senior leaders, all of the senior leaders inside of Hamas remain in power and are not affected by this war. And right now, there really haven't been any senior leaders from inside of Gaza, namely Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. They are still in Gaza, likely somewhere underground in Rafah. So it's hard to understand how a military, Israel at this point, would conduct this war, move all the way until they're at this final stage, kind of have the Hamas leadership surrounded and say, okay, we'll call it here. Just don't do that stuff again, right? They've got Hamas against the ropes. It makes a lot of sense that they're going to try to push this through and once and for all clear the area of at least the senior Hamas leadership for the time being. Now, Rafah, I'll pull up a map here. It is in the southern portion of the Gaza Strip, and the reason that it is getting so much attention right now is that it's kind of the last safe space, if you will, for Palestinian refugees, the civilians all across Gaza. The way Israel has carried out this war, by and large, is they started in the north and they pushed south. They would put out announcements like they did earlier today to a certain area, and we'll put up some of the evacuation maps here showing the different districts and areas. They're saying avoid this number, go to this number, things like that. And Israeli forces have moved generally north to south, clearing those areas of Hamas militants as they go, or trying their best to do that, right? We still see Hamas operating in the north and central portions of Gaza. They have not moved into Rafah quite yet. So as Israel moved north to south, all of these civilians continued to push further south. They went from northern Gaza to central Gaza, from central Gaza to southern Gaza, and from southern Gaza all the way down to Rafah. So there's a lot of civilians there. Depending on your source, I've seen estimates everywhere from 1 million to 2.5 million civilians, or I should say people, sheltering in and around Rafah at this point. We have no idea what that number is, right? These are internally displaced people, refugees in the middle of a war. We're not going to get a clear number in the middle of hostilities, right? There's not a clear census going on of the total number of people in Rafah. But even if you take that low number, 1 million, and cut that in half, say it's 2x, it's exaggerated 2x, 500,000 people in Rafah makes for a very challenging operating environment for any sort of military force. So the civilian population here, the density of civilians in Rafah makes this a very, very challenging operation, which is why we are seeing now, as we've seen Israel do throughout the course of this war, they are prompting the civilians to evacuate the area. Now, what it sounds like is that they have built up some additional humanitarian zones in and around Khan Yunis to facilitate the move of some of these civilians. But look, there's no perfect answer here, right? The entire Gaza Strip is still somewhat of a war zone. A lot of homes are destroyed. A lot of infrastructure is destroyed. It's not like you can just take these people and move them back into one area. They're going to be cramped in another area. And there's going to be a lot of families that have moved 3, 4, 5, 6 times already, at least in the past few months. But the plan from Israel right now is to evacuate a portion of Rafah, the eastern portion. What I would expect to see based off of this is Israel will evacuate. Let's say Rafah is divided into 4 sections, right? We'll say section 1, 2, 3, and 4. They will evacuate section 1, give it a couple days maybe, then move military forces in to conduct their operations there. Once that is secure, and that could take a couple weeks even, they'll start to evacuate section 2. Section 2, same thing again. They move forces in after it's evacuated, and then they hold up in section 1, section 2, move into section 3. Section 4 is likely the area where Israel expects the senior Hamas militants to be hiding out. That's the area where there might be some Hamas headquarters or maybe the most extensive tunnel networks. That is going to be the last area, in all likelihood, that the IDF goes after. So what they can do then, by that point, is all of the other areas have been evacuated. They've kind of closed this noose around the Hamas leadership. That is probably what we're going to see here in the coming days and weeks. Now, a couple of reasons why this is kicking off now. Again, it's always been in the cards. It's hard to imagine a scenario since October 7th where Israel gets this close to dismantling Hamas, the closest they've ever been, right? And it's a far cry from saying that is actually going to happen, but they're at least relatively close, and close to killing or capturing some of the senior leaders. It's hard to imagine Israel is going to get this close and then just stop and let them go. So Rafah's always been in the cards, but what kind of triggered it to happen right now is recent ceasefire talks in Cairo just appear to have fallen through. So a Hamas delegation departed Cairo on Sunday, where it sounds like they've rejected the last few deals. They're not coming to any sort of agreement between Israel and Hamas. It doesn't sound like there's been much of a change in the stance of those two parties when it comes to the ceasefire, but either way, it does look like Israel is kind of waiting to see if there would be any sort of arrangement to where they could pull some of their hostages out, some of the captives that Hamas has out before any sort of military operation takes place. They say the latest round of Gaza ceasefire talks ended in Cairo after in-depth and serious discussions, the Hamas militant group said on Sunday, reiterating key demands that Israel once again rejected. The major Hamas demand that Israel continues to reject is the end of the war. And they say there's going to be a permanent ceasefire. All Israeli forces are going to leave the Gaza Strip, and that might be something that Israel is up for eventually. But again, when they seemingly have some of the Hamas leadership cornered in Rafah, that's a tough ask. And that's kind of a hard line that both sides have drawn. Now, the start of this Rafah operation also coincides with a significant Hamas rocket attack yesterday at Shalom, which is the vicinity of one of the few border crossings providing humanitarian aid from Israel into Gaza. So I'll pull up my map here. Shalom is in the southern portion of Israel along the border with Egypt. And it's important. It's an important one because you've got only a few border crossings into Gaza right now providing any sort of aid. This is one, we talked earlier about how so many civilians are holed up in and around Rafah. This is one that is helping distribute aid directly to so many Palestinian civilians that are in need of it in the southern portion of the Gaza Strip. So yesterday, Hamas claimed responsibility for and showed videos for a rocket attack that they carried out against Shalom. Now, there was a little bit of confusion here and mixed wires at times where you have the Shalom checkpoint. It does not appear as though the checkpoint was under fire, the actual gate that trucks pass through moving into Gaza. And then you've got the village approximately 2,000 feet away. Not very far, especially when you're talking about these unguided Hamas rockets being fired from modified launchers. 2,000 feet is you're going to have rockets spraying in every direction. Right, so that is well within the likely impact area. What I have seen as of late is more than 10 Israeli soldiers were wounded, and at least 4 so far have been killed in that Hamas rocket attack. It does not look. I would not read this as Israel is beginning the Rafah operation because of that rocket attack, kind of the other way around. I would view this as Hamas recognized that the talks fell through and that an operation is imminent, so they're back to conducting some of these more aggressive attacks like this against a border crossing checkpoint, providing humanitarian aid that they might have held off on just a few weeks prior when a ceasefire was still potentially in the cards. Again, what we've seen over the last few weeks is Israel putting out videos showing how they are preparing their forces for a Rafah operation, resting and refitting, reorganizing troops, going through AARs, additional training events, setting the plans and operations in place for movement into Rafah. This is not something that just happened because of a rocket attack yesterday. Now, as a result of that attack, Israel went ahead and at least temporarily shut the Shalom checkpoint, again, which is notable and understandable. It's a rational response. In any sort of war zone, security comes first. You can't provide humanitarian assistance, medical aid, reconstruction, anything like that until you have security. The Shalom checkpoint is Israel's responsibility in terms of security. Israel is responsible for the safety and security of the people at that checkpoint, the trucks crossing in, the drivers crossing in. Rockets impacting anywhere near that vicinity shows that Israel does not currently have that situation under control enough to allow for the continuation of a humanitarian aid mission. That might change in the next few hours. It might change in the next few days. That I would not expect the checkpoint to be closed indefinitely, but it is a requirement on Israel's part. Any modern military would do this. Stop non-military activity until the security situation is established, security is reestablished, and then you can move back into conducting these humanitarian type missions. Now, another item that kind of coincides with this Rafah operation that's getting a fair amount of attention around the world is the closure of the Al Jazeera office in Israel, which is going to affect the amount of information we get coming out of Rafah as this operation kicks off. It's, everything in a war zone is connected. In the middle of a war, everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. I don't know that I would necessarily read this as this action was taken because the Rafah operation was imminent, because it looks like this is something that Israel has kind of been pressuring for quite a while and just now happened to go through. I could be wrong in that, but again, I don't know that I would read this as directly correlating to the timing of the Rafah operation. So Netanyahu's cabinet just yesterday shut down Al Jazeera for as long as the war in Gaza continues, saying that the organization threatened national security. Now, this decision has to be recertified every 45 days, and it includes shutting down Al Jazeera broadcasts in Arabic and English, shutting down Al Jazeera's offices in Israel, seizing equipment used for its broadcasts, and limiting access to its websites. What I did not see was any sort of shutdown of Al Jazeera in Gaza. So it's not clear how they would enforce that, if they wanted to enforce that, but it sounds like the offices and the infrastructure in Israel proper are being shut down. I would expect that we're still going to see, to some degree, reporting from Al Jazeera members coming out of Gaza, but we'll have to wait and see on that front. So Al Jazeera put out a statement saying, quote, Israel's ongoing suppression of the free press, seen as an effort to conceal its actions in the Gaza Strip, stands in contravention of international and humanitarian law. Israel's direct targeting and killing of journalists, arrests, intimidation, and threats will not deter Al Jazeera from its commitment to cover, whilst more than 140,000 Palestinian journalists have been killed since the beginning of the war in Gaza. They said the network vehemently rejects the allegations presented by Israeli authorities suggesting professional media standards have been violated. It reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the values embodied by its code of ethics. The UN Human Rights Office also weighed in on this on Twitter, where they said, we regret cabinet decision to close Al Jazeera in Israel. A free and independent media is essential to ensuring transparency and accountability. Now even more so given tight restrictions on reporting from Gaza. Freedom of expression is a key human right. We urge the government to overturn the ban. So again, whether, Al Jazeera, certainly a controversial organization in a lot of ways, whether you approve or disapprove of this specific action taken by Israel, one thing is for certain, it is going to reduce the total number of resources we have coming out of this war and reporting from this war. But we'll have to wait and see how it affects the actual reporting on the ground in Gaza. In Gaza. It's not entirely clear yet, and what that'll look like as this operation moves forward in Rafah. All right, so in terms of what to expect going forward here, likely to see continuation of Israeli airstrikes against key targets in eastern Rafah. That already started, is probably going to continue every day until and during the ground operation. The evacuation of civilians is currently underway. I would not expect Israel to move in on the ground, conduct a significant offensive operation until a serious number of those civilians have had the ability to evacuate. That is all going to be dependent on how quickly Israel can process those Palestinians through some sort of security checkpoint where they're screening for Hamas militants and leaders and allowing them to move further north. Again, if there's a long line stretched out on the street with hundreds or thousands of people lined up trying to evacuate, I wouldn't expect Israel to kick this thing off, but rather give them more time, maybe a couple more days to evacuate. It's in Israel's best interest to get as many civilians out of that area as possible before they move any sort of significant military force in. However, now that this has begun, it's entirely likely that we see some sort of ground element move back into Gaza, an armored element that we've seen that has been resting and refitting in Israel and maybe setting the stage, some sort of outer cordon for the eventual ground move into Rafah, which again, that whole operation has now begun, likely just a matter of days before we see an uptick in combat on the ground in Rafah between Hamas and the IDF. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We've added a few features as of late. So a bunch of articles, usually 2 to 4 articles coming out every week, talking about a variety of national security topics, wars and conflicts from around the world. We've started to add more audio articles, as well as a weekly audio roll-up between myself and the editor-in-chief, Adam Roussel, looking at the articles written the past week, asking us some questions about those, and then what we have going forward, and then some discussion posts for members, kind of a community discussion, if you will, around a variety of national security subjects. So, of course, if interested in any of that, check out the link in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.